So, hello and a very warm welcome to you. I'm Simon Reach, the Publishing Manager for Ruskin Mill Trust and also a researcher for the Field Centre. Thank you for joining us for this, the second in a new series of monthly online talks on the subject of holistic science. These talks are a collaboration between Schumacher College and the Field Centre. I should mention that it was Schumacher's 30th anniversary yesterday, so many hearty congratulations there. Together, the Schumacher College and Field Centre, we feel that it is important to make these presentations available free of charge. If you wish to make a donation, you can find details of how to do so in a subsequent email. Now, this month we are delighted to welcome Dr. Judah Sassoon, and Judyth will be presenting on The Beaver, My Teacher, a study in holistic zoology. Before I hand over to Judyth, I would like to give a brief introduction to her work. Judyth received her doctorate in biochemistry from Oxford University. She spent the next 10 years in academia, working on the structure of antioxidant molecules at the University of Bern, Switzerland, and at the RIKEN Institute, Japan. On returning to the UK, she shifted her focus to whole organisms, and since 2009 has worked at the University of Bristol on comparative morphology of fossilized aquatic vertebrates. She teaches biology to pre-university, undergrad and postgrad students, and joined the Ruskin Mill Field Centre to pursue studies of Goethe's morphological works and contribute to the Goethe and Science research project there. After Judith's presentation, there will be time for questions and a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, then please write this in the Q&A section. That is distinct from the chat section. So pop your questions into the Q&A sections. I will then gather these together and I will shape them into a discussion with Judyth. So Judyth, without further ado, we would like to welcome you very warmly to this presentation.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Schumacher College and Field Centre, for inviting me to speak on this subject. And first, may I wish everyone a very happy April Fool's Day, because I think it's very appropriate to be talking about a hilariously looking animal on April the 1st. And there is really something very comical and very clown-like about the beaver. There's this enormous nose that presents itself, and then there's these prominent buck teeth beneath it. But I think that, like all traditional clowns, like the classic court jesters and court fools, one really does need to take the beaver very, very seriously. So I'm going to start by setting out the background to this study to explain why a holistic approach to animals is interesting for me. Then I will say something about the holistic method. And then I will present some highlights from the study itself with some conclusions. So I did this study mainly on the European beaver, the Eurasian beaver. And there are, in fact, two species of beaver. They're very similar. There's the North American beaver called the Castor canadensis and the European beaver, which is Castor fiber. And they do look very alike, and until quite recently were not really recognized as separate species. They don't interbreed, though, so they are separate species. Now, my observations were on the wild Eurasian beaver. I did the observations in Poland and Belarus, and some also in England, Scotland, and Wales. And I also looked at prepared anatomical specimens, dissections, and various skeletons in museums and so on. Now, the motivation for doing a holistic study on an animal comes actually out of my work on paleontology, where there is a strong interest in the relationship between parts of an organism and how they relate to the whole. Within a holistic perspective, it's generally thought that the whole is not fully derivable from the parts. And in paleontology, we study the petrified remains of extinct animals, many of which have no extant analogues. So we do actually attempt to reconstruct a whole organism from its fossilized parts. So the reason I undertook this particular exploration was to understand what it's like to think and work holistically with a living animal, and to see if any of the experience of working in this way is transferable back to paleontology and to my work in that field. And I chose the beaver as my working animal. So in this way, the beaver became my teacher in a holistic study. Now, I'm just going to share my screen and we'll go into some slides. I hope everyone can see that. A word about methodology first then. For this study, I considered the methods of two great men. One was Johann von Goethe and the other was Kurt Goldstein. And for those of you who heard the previous lecture in this series by Craig Holdredge, you'll remember how he spoke about Goethe and his way in science, his way of doing science. Now, a recording of that lecture is available in the Schumacher website for anyone who would like to hear it. And Goethe had a holistic view of science and understood that research required both analytical and synthetic approaches. On this slide, I've outlined Goethe's method as he set it out in several essays and some of his works. The method involves intense observation of a phenomenon, followed by close comparisons between the phenomenon of interest and related phenomena. These can be, for example, experimental studies where you set up closely connected experiments and vary the parameters of those experiments, or they can be variations on anatomical parts. For example, I think Craig spoke about the leaves that Goethe looked at in plants. And the observed phenomena then need to be ordered within a series. And then there follows a reflective step in which the perception of relationships between the phenomena is allowed to give rise to a unifying whole, a unifying idea. In this way, the individual phenomena are then like the parts of the unifying idea, which is the whole. And the unifying idea, the wholeness, arises from perceiving the exact relationships of the phenomena of the parts. And each part then becomes a particular expression of the whole, which is also organized by the whole in its relationships. So wholeness is like an intuition that arises from perceiving the correct relationships between parts, but in itself, it is not a directly perceptible thing to the senses. It is something that involves a reflective and intuitive step, which is as if it's seen in the mind. Now, I will mention Goethe again shortly, but now I wish to say something about Kurt Goldstein, who is this other practitioner, holistic practitioner, who contributed his ideas to the way I work. And Kurt Goldstein was a 20th century German neurologist who lived through the First and Second World War. And he worked with brain-injured soldiers and patients with psychological disorders, and developed a holistic way of diagnosing neurological diseases. What he did was he approached patients as phenomenologies, or as he himself put it, he said self-realizing performances. He regarded patients as self-realizing performances. Organisms were self-realizing performances. And by this approach, he concluded that theories in neurology that mapped activities of the brain or certain neurological activities to certain specific regions of the brain, he felt they were inadequate to support his own observations on how an organism worked because of the fabulous adjustability of organisms to injuries. So he rather thought that it was better to speak of the brain, and of course by extension of the body, as an interconnected whole rather than as being made up of compartments which are responsible for separate activities. So out of Kurt Goldstein's work, it's possible to distill a method that he used. And here it is, a summary of how he proposed how one should approach a human patient. You first look at the phenomenon that presents itself to you with giving no special preference to any part. You accept how it appears to you, but you do observe closely, and you're trying not to be diverted by any one aspect that interests you particularly, perhaps, or perhaps if a patient presents themselves with a particular ache, you don't focus necessarily on that, but you take that as part of the whole. And then whatever you do, whatever you focus on, you always have to keep referring back to the whole, zooming in and zooming out. And you can analyze, analysis is perfectly allowed, but the whole must be kept in mind at all times. And finally, a very important step is to consider also the context of the entire situation which is presenting itself. So the method that he outlined for diagnosing patients, you can see that it's also completely relevant and possible to apply this for a study of a living animal. And so I did this, or I tried to do this, and I chose the beaver. So the next question perhaps is, why did I choose the beaver for a holistic study? Well, one compelling reason is that in Britain, the beaver is quite back in fashion, you might say, not as a fashion accessory this time, but it's returning to our landscape. And there are beavers, there have been beavers in Britain in the past. So they were here from perhaps the Pleistocene, the start of the most recent ice age, right up to perhaps the 12th century, when they began to vanish. I think there is a definite reference to beavers being in Britain in the 12th century by Gerald of Wales. And then over time, up until the 17th century, the references in the writings of those times become fewer and fewer, perhaps. And in the 17th century, there's some doubt as to whether there are any beavers left in Britain altogether. And of course, when beavers vanished and industrialization reformed the landscape, the cultural memory of beavers vanished as well. And this is really quite an extraordinary situation, because we have to consider that in the distant past, beavers and their activities contributed in some way to pretty much every human need. So, for example, they contributed to medicine, they contributed to clothing, to the making of clothing. They were indirectly perhaps contributing to building materials, ornaments, weapons, and so on. And then they vanished and were forgotten. And the signs of their previous activity stopped being recognized. But the landscape does remember. So if you go diving in Loch Tay, which is in Scotland, you come across the remains of a drowned forest, which is about 8,000 years old. And on these stumps, there are signs of beaver chewings. So the beavers were there already at that time. And Professor Brian E. Coles from Exeter University has shown that this collective amnesia in Britain means that the marks of beaver activity, even more recent marks of beaver activity, more recent than 8,000 years, in the archaeological record, were frequently mistaken for human marks. And it is only after she made a study of the signs that beavers leave behind in Brittany, in countries where there are beavers, that she started to recognize these signs in the archaeological record of Britain. So here is a typical British farmland landscape, one that has not seen beavers for perhaps 400 years. And you can contrast that very nicely with this, which is an example of a forest landscape in Poland where beavers are active. And we immediately see one of the signatures of beavers. One of the signatures of beavers, by human standards at least, is that they make a frightful mess. And here on the next slide, there is a Devon mess, a mess in Devon, a beaver mess in Devon. So what do we see? We see a kind of low barrier here, made up of sticks, and it's welded with mud. And this is a small dam. And behind it, we see a beaver pool. And down here, we see another beaver pool. And we also see these channels, which actually connect beaver pools. And in the next slide, we see other marks. So we see chewed sticks, a chewed log. We see a beaver haul-out point and a scent mound. And these are all signs of beaver activities. They also build lodges and they also burrow into the banks of rivers. And so by human standards, a beaver landscape is a really very chaotic looking landscape. But by nature's standard, this is a bountiful and enlivening mess. So yes, beavers do modify their environments. They are certainly landscape architects, and certainly if nature does not meet their needs, they will adjust the situation so that it does. They must be found near fresh water. They need fresh water, and they also need a supply of broad-leafed vegetation. And they do prefer slow-moving water. So if there's a fast-moving river and the beavers want to stay there, they will create these dams to slow the water down. So what beavers do is they bring a slow rhythm to nature. They slow the rhythm down. And at the same time, they raise the water table, they create beaver pools, they create channels between pools, and they can flood the landscape, and they can establish wetlands. So what you can also say is that beavers allow for the self-realization of wetlands. They create the conditions for wetlands, and wetlands create the conditions for beavers. There's this reciprocity there. And I've also mentioned this slow rhythm that they introduce to the landscape. And in fact, it goes beyond slowing down the flow of water. They introduce also a slow rhythm to the landscape long term. So they create a breathing cycle of beaver activity and beaver chaos, which is then followed by renewal and re-emergence of the woodland. They prefer to eat the bark from wetland trees which are fast growing, like willow and birch. And what they'll do is they will work on them and they will build their structures and introduce their creative chaos. But when the food runs out, when they've chewed enough, felled enough trees and chewed enough branches, they will leave the area and they will allow the landscape to recover. So trees, because they're fast growing, will regenerate and the woodland will once more advance. And then once that's happened, the beavers can come back. They will return and start again. And they really do influence biodiversity. They really do contribute positively to biodiversity. And there's many ways they do that. But for example, when they coppice the trees, they bring in more light into woodlands. They can create breeding pools for fish and insects by creating beaver pools. They create standing and fallen dead wood and many opportunities for organisms to use those. So here is a picture of one of the earliest pictures of the Devon beavers. Many people now are quite happy and very positive about the fact that beavers are being returned to Britain. Their ecological aspect is thought to outweigh any of their destructive tendencies. So we've now put the beavers into an environmental context. And I will now like to place it in a comparative context with other mammals that are similar. So the beaver is a rodent, and we all know about rodents. They are these scurrying, gnawing, whisker-quivering, rather frenetic creatures sometimes. And they actually make up about 40% of all mammal species. And they have a great diversity of habits and apparently boundless adaptability. They can adapt very well, some of them, to human landscapes, for example. And here we have a picture of a skeleton of a beaver by Edward Dalton, who was an anatomical artist much admired by Goethe. And Goethe wrote an essay on the skeletal structure of rodents and observed the following. He observed that inwardly, meaning at the level of the skeleton, and especially at the level of the postcranial skeleton, which I'm outlining right now with my arrow. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. At the level of the postcranial skeleton, Goethe said that there seems to be an overall persistence of a basic form throughout the rodent group. So in the beaver, we see that there's a rather typical rodent-like skull, which resembles a grab cutter grapple, and a very typical hunched appearance where the lumbar vertebrae are higher up than the thoracic vertebrae. And also other typical features which are found in other rodents. The feet of the beaver can be laid flat on the ground. Rodents tend to be either plantigrade, meaning their feet are flat on the ground, or semi-plantigrade. And they have also 5 toes. Beavers have 5 toes on each of their limbs. And they're able to raise themselves on their hind legs and manipulate objects with their forepaws. And rodents generally also have a collarbone, like other mammals that can do the same. They can stand up on their hind legs. So Goethe wrote like this: inwardly, rodents are determined generically and held within strict bounds. Now, Goethe was interested in perceiving, as he put it, the productive forces of nature. He wanted to see nature in living movement. And he tried always to see nature in a constant state of development and change. And he proposed that nature, in nature, polarities or polar opposites work together as a creative driving force. And furthermore, he believed that there was an economy of nature in which polar opposites worked together and compensated for each other. So for example, here with these rodents, if we see a persistent, an inward persistence of a generic and ancestral form, to compensate for that, Goethe pointed out that there was an outward gesture of, as he put it, the rodents were given to unbridled activity and have undergone alterations in diverse ways. And he then pointed out that there were some rodents like rats that tended towards carnivory, and others like the capybara that tended towards ruminants, like ruminant animals. Some are more like apes, like the squirrels. Some are more like bats, like the flying squirrels. So rodents can be very, very diverse externally, even though they sort of keep an inner core of persistence, of a generic rodent persistence. What I've shown you here is some aquatic rodents. And what we can see then is, as I say, this dynamic, the memory of the rodent group within the skeleton. You can sort of more or less see that there is some similarity between these animals, but at the same time, there's this great plasticity in the outwardly oriented parts of the creatures. So we have plasticity in the feet, in the tail, and to some extent also in the skull. What I've done here, though, is I've collected together a group of aquatic rodents to demonstrate that there's even different ways of being an aquatic rodent. So up here we have the water voles, 2 water voles. Here we have a koipu. Here we have a group of capybaras. And here we have the rat. Now, the rat is strictly speaking, not an aquatic rodent in the same way that the others are, but it's one of those rodents that can adapt to more or less any situation at all. And right in the middle, we have the beaver. So we have all these different expressions of rodentness, all these different ways of being, in this case, an aquatic rodent. And these comparisons within a group, a closely related group, Goethe spoke about this, can give one a sense of what the wholeness of being a rodent is. And then the beaver is like one expression of that rodentness, one type of expression, is one way of being a rodent. If we look then at the skulls of the 2 largest rodents, that is, the very largest is the capybara, the beaver is the second largest, we can see the prominent teeth, the thing that is perhaps most striking about rodents. And in beavers, these teeth are orange, and also they tend to be orange in the capybaras, but for some reason this sample, this specimen is quite old, and I think they faded. But we see that the enamel of the beaver's teeth is orange, and that they are chisel shaped, and behind the incisor teeth, there's 1 pair of incisors in each rodent on each jaw. There is a space, a curved space, the same for the beaver, where one might place a canine tooth if this were a carnivorous animal. But in the beaver, there is no canine tooth, there are no canines at all. And working further back, we have the premolars and molars. In the beaver, it's 1 premolar and 3 molars. So Goethe said that nature binds rodents to its teeth, to their teeth. And he said that this was because teeth participate, and again I'm quoting Goethe, teeth participate in an urge to gnaw and chew, which he described as a convulsive passion of unintentionally destructive gnawing. And then he countered that. Again, he saw the polarity. He said, yes, but this destructive passion, in human terms at least, destructive perhaps, in fact is a preliminary to a creative act, like the act of building a nest or a shelter or a burrow. And specifically for the beaver, this brings into mind the issues that are being raised about beaver reintroduction, because on the one hand, farmers will say, yes, they flood fields and they can destroy crops, and they can make banks collapse by burrowing into them. So they can make a mess and they can create havoc. So they are destructive. Whilst on the other hand, they are highly creative, and they contribute to the incredible biodiversity of the landscape and create these incredible structures in which they live and which they use to slow down rivers. So now let's look at the beaver itself. And to ask maybe how is the beaver? How is the beaver a rodent? How is the beaver in itself? How does it perform itself, using Kurt Goldstein's language? So what I did, I made quite a lot of sketches during this study to observe the movements, the morphological movements, the morphological and dynamic movements of the beaver. And obviously I collected an awful lot of observations, some of which I've just outlined here to kind of give you the impression that I was trying to judge them without privileging any particular observation, that I just wanted to see the whole first. And then by contemplating and reflecting on the observations that I made, and picturing the animal as accurately as possible in my mind as a dynamic entity, I wanted to see what sort of thing arose out of that. So what I'm going to give you now is a kind of highlights of these observations and some of the insights that they brought with them. So quite often, the first sort of encounter with a beaver, the first sight of a beaver, is of a swimming beaver towards sunset. And this was also my first encounter with them. I was by quiet water, and very suddenly, just as soon as the sun had set, but it was still quite light, this creature, this dark creature, emerges from the depth. You can sometimes see little bubbles coming first, and then it comes up and it hangs in the water, just kind of looking around to see what's going on. And then once it's worked out that all is safe, it starts to swim backwards and forwards and starts getting on with its activity. And so for me, there was a sort of beaver mood, which was this quietness that was always very striking when I saw them appear. And we can also notice here, as we're looking at these swimming beavers, how when a beaver swims, it becomes a long animal. It becomes long. And it seems to give itself up to the water. It seems to give its shape up to the water and become elongated. If we then contrast that with beavers on land, so here's the contrast. Here's a swimming beaver, another one, and beavers on land. We see that the beaver is a shapeshifter. It has a sort of polarity of shape that it produces when it's in water and when it's on land. On land, the beaver looks more round, more compact, more self-contained, whilst in the water, it is extended and flatter. So there's this polarity between roundness and flatness between land and water, between, you might say, more closure and more openness. And there's also the smoothness of the beaver's movement in water. And on land, they tend to sort of have a certain bumbling, rather heavy awkwardness. That's yet another polarity of movement that one can observe. And the polarity between the sort of round and more extended is quite interesting, because roundness maximizes internal volume relative to surface area. So it is definitely a gesture of enclosure and autonomy, of separation from the environment, and you might say emancipation from the surroundings to some degree. While a flatter shape is an open gesture. You are there increasing the surface area relative to volume. And beavers creating these two movements seem to give themselves up to water or remain compact on land. However, even if beavers are swimming, though, even when they open their bodies up, there is nevertheless retained a sort of general roundness, you might say, a sort of at least substantial body that they retain. And this seems to be the generic shape of the rodent that it has. And we can see, as we go further and look at the beaver, how it actually presents itself in its body. So broadly, we have a bit of a round neck with a round head with practically no neck, and a rather barrel-shaped body. And that contrasts with a rather flat, scaly, and hairless tail. The shape of the tail can actually vary between individuals. Now, actually, I'm looking at this one and I'm seeing that it's got a very broad tail. So actually, I think this is a Canadian beaver I've got here, but these others are Eurasian, I think. So there's this contrast between round body and flat tail as well. An enclosed body and an open tail. So the tail reminds us of the possibility of swimming. And it's also, in its openness, it has a use for the beaver. So beavers will sometimes sit by the bank of a river and dip their tails in the water. This is particularly on hot summer days, because they retain a lot of heat in their body, but at the same time, they need to cool down. So they cool down through the tail. Now, the coloration of beavers is generally uniform. They vary their colors. They can be they can go all the way from black to sort of golden colored, and anything in between. We can also see that there's no real external ornamentation, possibly with the exception of this hilarious nose. But the eyes are quite small, the ears are quite small. There is a long philtrum there, and then beneath that we see the huge teeth, and we see whiskers. And the beaver is able to close off its sensory organs when it swims. So it closes its eyes with a nictitating membrane. It's a transparent membrane, which means it can still see underwater, but it's further protected. It closes its ears, it closes its nose, and furthermore, it manages to seal up its mouth behind its teeth. So the teeth are always on display, but the mouth is sealed up when they swim. And furthermore, the beaver encloses itself in this very, very dense layer of fur and some degree of fat. Most of the fat is found around the abdominal region, which already give it even more of a sense of roundness. And the fur is worth pointing out because that was one of the reasons why beavers were hunted. It is one of the most waterproof fur coats in existence. It's comprised of 2 layers of fur. There's a longer layer, a layer of longer hairs, which are about 6 centimeters long, and a very sort of soft and dense insulating mat beneath that of shorter fur, shorter hairs, which are about 2 centimeters long. So it's a double layer of fur, which the beavers also further waterproof with oily secretions from their glands. So we can look at another polarity here between the forelimbs and the hind limbs. So here we see the front paws. We see that they are unwebbed, that they have 5 digits. You can see 5 digits here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are prehensile, they are very dexterous. They're capable of making very fine movements, and they can grasp sticks and rotate them in their paws, and they have long nails and they can dig with their paws. The thumb is not opposable as in humans or primates, but what they are able to do, the thumb and little finger are set further down than the other 3, and you can see here in this picture, if I can get you can see here that it's the little finger that supports the twig as a thumb in this picture. If we then go on to the hind limbs, these you can see are webbed, and they have fur only on the dorsal surface, on the upper surface. They also have one very very key characteristic. The second toe is a double toe. It's a double toenail rather. This is a preening toe. So the toe has this double nail, and the beaver, they're fastidious groomers. They're always removing things from their fur. The beavers sit on the bank and they will scratch their fur and remove burrs and parasites and twigs and all sorts of things, and prevent their tail their fur from matting. They'll keep it soft and supple like that. So they are always using this grooming nail, this double toenail, to do that. If we then go back to the skeleton again, one of the things that Goethe liked about Dalton's pictures was that he drew a skeleton within the outline of the animal. And if you look at that, what you might notice is that were you to just find the skeleton, you might not necessarily come to the conclusion that the defleshed skeleton does not immediately suggest the appearance of the fully fleshed animal. So it's as if the beaver hides its very foundation deep in its body. But if we look at this skeleton, we can still see that there are some aspects which are very specific to the beaver, specialized to the beaver. So we have, for example, that the skeleton is actually quite robust and heavy in places. It's quite heavy in the limbs and quite heavy in the pelvic girdle, and also particularly in the jaw. And if you look at the proximal limb bones, so you look at the humerus and the femur, they are quite short, very robust, and rather oddly shaped. They're quite sort of stunted looking. And this is rather typical of a swimming or digging rodent. But then the dynamic following that, if you look at the radius and ulna, that is longer. And the tibia and fibula also is longer than the proximal limb bone. And then in the hind legs, the feet are huge, whilst the front paws are actually quite small. And this is more clearly seen perhaps here. This is a specimen from Bristol Museum. You can see how huge the feet are compared to the front paws, although I'm afraid the front paw there is missing somewhat. But you can see that dynamic there. And here is a much clearer picture of the forelimbs in the beaver, and you can also see its collarbone there particularly. And just one more detail about the forelimbs. In human beings, we are able to make movements of our hands, so we can turn our hands up and down. We can rotate the radius around the ulna, and that makes these two movements. And so pronation means palm down, and supination is when the palm is turned up. But in beavers, they can't do that. Their radius and ulna is stiff and firmly held together in the forearm, and the forearm is kept in the pronated posture, so they're not able to turn their palms upwards, which is why in the previous picture, when you saw the beaver chewing the twig, the paws were facing downwards towards the ground. And the beaver will always manipulate its twigs in that position. If we look at the spine, we see more dynamics here, morphological dynamics. We see a beautiful wave-like gesture. If you look at the spine from the side, you will see these dorsal projections. And sometimes they're tall and sometimes they are short. So there's a movement of hardly any dorsal projections, then they become taller in the thoracic vertebrae, and then they get smaller towards the tail. In the spine in dorsal view, when you look at it from above, there is an opposite gesture. So you can't see the dorsally facing spines there, but what you can see is lateral spines which follow the opposite movement. So where you have tall dorsal spines, you have rather shorter lateral spines, but when the dorsal spines get smaller, the lateral spines can get bigger. So that's the dynamic, this beautiful wave-like dynamic, both from the side and from upwards. You can see a beautiful movement there. And I think I mentioned this before, but no, I didn't mention this. If you look at these caudal vertebrae, even though I said you might not necessarily be able to reconstruct in your mind the shape of a beaver from its skeleton necessarily, nevertheless, there are hints within the skeleton. So here, these caudal vertebrae are really quite flat, suggesting there's a suggestion of a flat tail when you look at them. And if you are working holistically and you've understood the beaver as an aquatic creature, then you might intuit that there's a sort of inner necessity for a broader tail than you might immediately imagine. It comes out of this understanding of the relationships between the body parts in creating a whole which is aquatic as well as land-based. So you might be able to intuit the tail without knowing it in the first place. Then I'm going to say something about the beaver's digestive system, its feeding and digestion. So I've said something about the teeth. The teeth grow continuously and they have a cutting edge. What they do is that the beavers constantly work on their teeth by gnawing, and they optimize their shape through use. And then if we look then at the digestive system, we have the stomach, we have the small intestine, and then at the junction between the small intestine and the large intestine, we have a bag-like structure called a cecum. Now, this cecum is very specialized in the beaver because it contains microorganisms which the beaver itself creates as a niche through the ingestion of bark. Bark and vegetation contain lignocellulose, which is a substance quite difficult to digest. And this is why the beavers need to create a helpful microbiome within their digestive gut to help them digest and consume the wood. So what beavers are doing is they're creating an inner niche, and that contrasts with the niche that they create externally as well. The beavers, the beavers, they have a process of double digestion as well. And what that means is that they recycle their pellets, but what they don't do, they don't regurgitate their ingesta like ruminant animals do. So they don't cough up some of their ingesta and then rechew it and then swallow it in any kind of rumination. What they do is they allow the digester to pass through their gut right to the end. Then they use their feet to palpate their anal area. They produce a pellet and they will re-ingest it. This initial pellet is usually quite green and is ingested pretty much immediately. And then the pellet then passes a second time through the gut, is digested, and then the final dung which the beaver produces is brown, and that's usually expelled in water. So this process, it reflects their strong emphasis on the metabolic processes. They have this highly specialized hindgut fermentation. The ruminant animals like cows are foregut fermenters. The beavers are hindgut fermenters. And then we get on to the urinogenital system of the beavers, which is very interesting indeed. In most placental mammals, you have a separate anus, or rather an anus which is separate from the urinogenital system, or the urinogenital canal. So you either have two openings, or you have just one anus, anal opening and the urinogenital canal opening, or you sometimes have three openings where you have a total separation between anus, urinal opening, and genital opening. However, beavers are placental mammals, but beavers retain a much more primitive structure. They resemble more the marsupial animals, the pouched animals, or the monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, because they have a cloaca, which means that their anal and urinal and genital openings are combined into one channel, into one opening, and this is called a cloaca. So you might say that they have held back their development in that respect, that by holding the development of their urinogenital system in this more primitive condition, they've held it back from development. But there is a compensation here in that area of the body as well. To compensate for that holding back, they develop scent glands, quite staggering scent glands. So they have these pink ones, they are the anal glands, and above these are the castor sacs. Now, the castor sacs of beavers are well known. They were one of the reasons why beavers, or another reason why beavers were hunted, because they produce castoreum oil. And the castoreum oil was valued for its medicinal properties, because it can be an analgesic. It has aspirin-like properties, especially if the beavers feed on willow trees. And the fluid is very viscous, and it smells rather musky, and it was also used by the perfume industry. So that's the castoreum oil. For beavers, they use castoreum oil as a territorial marker. And you always know if the beaver is spraying from its castor sacs because it stands there and sprays. There are also the anal glands, and these are more for communication within the family groups. They produce secretions which you can, if you see a beaver rubbing its backside on a scent mound, it's giving communication to usually its family members about itself. So now we're going to say something about their family life. I think I might have mentioned that the sexes of beavers are very similar. They're very hard to tell apart. However, if a female like this one is lactating, you can see that there are 4 nipples on its body, and she can then be recognized as a female. The male and females pair monogamously and produce maybe between 2 and 4 kits in a litter, and the babies are born quite precocial, so they are already well formed and active. And they learn to swim within the first 24 hours after birth, and they will learn to swim within the beaver's lodge. In fact, within the beaver's lodge, there's usually a pool of water which connects to the outside, and the beaver kits will learn to swim in that. They are generally too buoyant to actually dive and go outside, so they will stay in there for a short while. The family groups are very, very highly territorial, but extremely social within them. So there is actually a dominance hierarchy from the oldest to the youngest. So you usually have within a lodge a breeding pair, you have also subadults, and you have the new kits. And everybody cooperates. In fact, the subadults will quite often help to feed and tend the new kits. And everybody, once they're out of the lodge, will be contributing to the building of dams, lodges, and whatever is needed. So there's a real sort of community effort here within the very tight-knit, though, and enclosed family unit. There's a very cute thing that can happen sometimes. I don't have a photograph of it. The kits can sometimes ride on the tail of their parent when the beaver is walking, or they can be carried in the forelimbs and in the forepaws. So it's quite sweet, really. And there's an awful lot of communication and vocalization that goes on between the beavers. Finally, maybe a word about the lodge. This is the house, the place where they live. Lodges can be built on banks sometimes, or within the water. In this situation, what you actually have is interesting. You've got a burrow here in the bank, and initially the beavers may just build a burrow and live within that. But sometimes if the water level then rises too much, actually in this case it hasn't, but if it rises too much, they will then raise the top part and create a sort of dome above that. And this is on the banks. Whereas they can also build lodges within the streams, within the water. And these can be quite large structures. Sometimes they can be 2 meters high, they can be 12 meters wide. And inside, there is a living space, which is above the waterline, with sometimes multiple chambers. And beavers use these lodges. They don't hibernate. In wintertime, if the winter's too harsh, they will stay within the lodge. And when the ponds freeze over, they will have stashed away a whole load of wood, of twigs and wood, to feed on during the winter time. The lodges are very warm inside, and sometimes on a sort of cold winter's day, you can actually see steam coming out of the top, where there is usually a breathing hole. So it's possible to tell that a lodge is active in that way. But they have this very private family life, you might say, a very private residence, very enclosed residence, although within the family they are extremely cooperative. So now here is a sort of conclusion of observations. So how can we tie this sort of study together, and what is the qualitative phenomenology of the beaver? The question really is, how does it perform and realize itself within the appearances that I've been looking at? So to sum up, firstly, the beavers, they're liminal beings. They live between land and water. In the physical level, they enclose the rodent core in a round body, but they show a polarity of closure and openness between body and tail. And also in swimming, they show an overall polarity of either compacting their body on land or extending it in water. But the body does need to be enclosed for the beaver to be a secondarily aquatic creature. In many of these creatures, which are secondarily aquatic, what that means is that they have evolved back from the land, as it were, that there's an ancestor that is, that the ancestral state is terrestrial, but then they have stepped back into the water. And quite a lot of these animals are much bigger than their terrestrial counterparts, much more round and enclosed. So physically, the beaver is enclosed, it's quite private, it hides its gender, and is quite self-contained in its body. Physiologically also, it exhibits quite a lot of autonomy. It encloses itself in thick fur and fat stores, and can close its senses off when it's in the water. And it constructs its microbiome to digest wood, and it constructs the specialized ecology within inwardly, as well as outwardly. In behavior, the family life is quite enclosed, it's monogamous, it's cooperative within the community. And then, so I didn't really say very much about beaver evolution, but there is evidence now to suggest that the activity of swimming, which, as I said, it involves a sort of associated physical closure and inward gesture, evolved alongside wood exploitation, which is that outward gesture that they have. So these two activities develop together, and that's a sort of a very holistic picture of the beaver, that it has also in its evolution the inner necessity to both enclose for swimming, but also have the outward gesture of changing its own environment. So I'm just going to show you that one last slide. This is sort of just in a sentence, the beaver dynamic. It's this profound inward and wide-reaching outward extension, which it seems to have. So it seems to extend into its body and also outwardly into the environment. And this is a black beaver, which you sometimes see in Poland. I have a list of references which people might wish to refer to. The two books from Kurt Goldstein, The Organism and Human Nature and the Like of Psychotherapy, are excellent. Otherwise, the references I've put here are all to do with beavers. So if you'd like me to return this slide later, then I will. So now I'm going to stop sharing. And that's me.
Wonderful, Judah. Thank you so much. So, Judyth, that was a fantastic piece of research there on those extraordinary liminal creatures. And I love your synopsis at the end of bringing it all together in a qualitative way through those different categories as well, to present a picture of the whole. We've had a number of questions come in, and I'd like to start with a question from Philippe. And Philippe asks, well, first of all, he frames his questions that he would like to address the question regarding the approaches of Goethe and Goldstein to abnormality and then pathological phenomena, respectively. So that's Goethe and abnormality, yes, and Goldstein pathological.
Yeah.
In Goethe's metamorphosis of plants, he mentions the role of irregular metamorphosis in disclosing what is otherwise hidden to our sense of vision, while attending to regular metamorphosis, which is displayed to the mind's eye as a unifying idea of the plant. And then there's a few questions here, and I'll read them as a whole and then just hand to you.
Can I just, should I comment on what Philippe has said?
Well, if I give you the questions as well,
okay, yeah,
and then you can shape a response. Okay. So, how is this insight of Goethe related to Goldstein's notion of pathology and wholeness as a way of getting evidences from the normal in human formations? How can we see that? How can we see that in the case of animals? What is special in Goethe's method of studying animals that is different from his method of studying plants or other types of phenomena is it perhaps the notion of compensation? So there's a lot there, and I'm going to give you that.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to comment on all of that,
No.
but first of all, Goethe and Goldstein, right? So Kurt Goldstein was influenced by Goethe quite clearly, but I think in both cases, I think it's quite obvious that if one is looking holistically at phenomena, that one comes to understand that there's a sort of certain so-called broad normal range, but there's also these abnormalities or sort of peripheral presentations which are unusual. And one can actually learn an awful lot about the way of being from these abnormal cases. And so Goldstein, in his book, The Organism, writes at length about his observations on the patients that he encountered, the sort of the way that how a patient with any sort of neurological disorder is always performing themselves and is always self-regulating themselves back to some kind of uniformity, which is perhaps different from the normal state, but is nevertheless as important as. Now, what other parts should I've already forgotten the question. What else was there in that question? There's something about plants and animals. How are they different in Goethe studies?
I can, yes, yeah. So perhaps I'll just reiterate those two last. So what is special in Goethe's method of studying animals that is different from the method of studying plants or other types of phenomena?
The works that I've read of Goethe's studies of animals are really his osteological work. And I don't really think there is a great deal of difference in principle. I mean, there's always the comparison, there's always the formation of an idea there. One of the difficulties, if you like, is that, of course, plants and animals are different. They have a different phenomenology. And I suppose the insights will be different. I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but it's as far as I can go with that, I think, at the moment.
Great. Thank you, Judith. And then, so during your presentation, there's obviously the upbuilding of the dam, but with the consequence of a lot of felling of the trees. And I think this is something that Dietrich has obviously picked up on, and he's asking, here in the Netherlands, beavers have been quite successfully reintroduced. So successfully that they are now a problem in some regions, since they undermine our dikes. I spoke to a muskrat hunter working for the authorities who rolled his eyes at the inconsistency of government policy. Both muskrats and beavers undermine dikes, but muskrats are an inadvertently introduced alien species here, while beavers are a reintroduced indigenous one, and hence the policy is that the first are hunted and the second are protected. Yeah. Would you have a different approach to this?
Right. I think it needs to be place specific in this case. So, of course, we know that. I mean, I'll speak for Britain as well. I'll speak what's going on in Britain. We now have a landscape here which is completely different from the wild landscape that beavers are happiest in. At the same time, beavers are extremely adaptable. So we would like them back because of their positive abilities, as it were, their positive contribution to biodiversity. But at the same time, the beaver is clearly destructive and can clearly create problems for the land. So a management policy is certainly being discussed here. Now, I'm not really in any position to comment on that particularly, but for example, there's a proposal of introducing for example, buffer zones, which I believe in some countries have been quite successful, between rivers where beavers are and between arable land. So if you introduce a buffer zone of about 20 meters, apparently it restricts the activities of the beaver. You protect trees with game paint or with fences. You can manage dams with flow devices and so on. And you can also, if things get too bad, you relocate the beavers. But I understand the problem of koipu. I mean, they were here too, and they were eradicated from Norfolk. I think there is, I haven't studied the two comparatively, and of course this is something that I would like to do. I think there is something about the koipu which could give an insight as to why particularly it is that doesn't belong in a certain landscape as opposed to another. But I do understand the issue. You know, they're both destructive, but we keep one and we don't keep the other. I'd like to know to what extent koipu, though, can have a positive effect on biodiversity. I'm not sure that they do in quite the same way as beavers.
Wonderful, thank you. I have a question from Philip. And as we're talking around beavers and their habitat, and then of course that was very closely, as you showed, the strong relationship to the plant kingdom that they have. And Philip's question is, do you think characteristics of willows, coppiceable, regrowable from broken branches, might have co-evolved with beavers?
So say again, do I think what?
So do you think willows might have co-evolved with beavers, might also have alder trees?
I don't know. Is the answer to that. I really don't know. Of course, there's so much nowadays written about the ecology of beavers that I think these are very specific questions which I don't know. I'm not actually a beaver specialist. You know, my speciality is in secondarily aquatic reptiles, but here we have you know, some rather intriguing questions which obviously would need to be studied as well. I don't know, I can't answer that.
Okay, thank you. I've got another intriguing question then, and this is Jill at the Field Centre, and Jill is asking, what are the differences between a European and North American beaver, both of those which you showed?
Okay, so the two species, these are the two extant species, they are quite similar in appearance, but there are a few differences. One thing actually is worth saying that they are so similar that, as I mentioned, they weren't recognized as separate species in the first instance. Such that in 1937, I think, if I remember, there was a reintroduction program in Finland, and they brought the Canadian beavers in rather than reintroduce European beavers. And there's actually a problem, I think, between keeping Canadian beavers and Eurasian beavers alongside each other, that the Canadian beavers are slightly bigger and they will tend to take over. So I think the solution in Finland then is, having reintroduced them, they then tried to cull them so that the Canadian beavers would no longer be there. But I think there are a few around in Europe. So it's like the grey squirrel, red squirrel story we have in Britain. But anyhow, as I say, physically they're quite similar. Anatomically, as I said, the Canadian beaver is a little bit bigger. The European beaver has a slightly longer skull. There's some skull details that one can draw on as well. I think that the nasal bones are more triangular in the European beaver. And certainly they have the different numbers of chromosomes. I think it's 48 for the Eurasian and 40 for the Canadian one. And then their behavior has been said to be different. The general opinion is that the European beavers don't build dams as much as the Canadian ones. But I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think that could be environment specific. So as some people may know, that the longest beaver dam is found in Canada, and it's just under 1 kilometre long. There's nothing quite that impressive in Europe. But what I've observed in Poland is just burrows, actually, rather than lodges for the European beaver. But I think also that, again, that's probably site-specific, and beavers can really be very flexible. They won't waste their energy if they don't need to, but if they feel like it, they will. So that's a few differences.
Judah, thank you. And I've got one last question, but I'm going to sneak in 2 questions into one. And this is Sue, and she's wanting to know, do we know exactly when beavers went extinct in Britain? And as an adjunct to that, there is Ava asking, do they have a natural predator?
Do they have a natural predator?
Do they have a natural predator?
That I would not be able to say. I'll answer that one first. I don't know, but perhaps those people who live in countries where there are wolves could tell me that. I'm not actually sure that, because they are quite, they can be quite bulshy, yeah, but I think maybe, I'm not sure that, I can't answer that. As for when they went extinct from Britain, there's actually some discussion as to when they really did, because they certainly were around in the 12th century, according to this Gerald of Wales, and then probably were extinct by the 17th century. But in between, it's a question of when that actually happened. They may have been in Scotland right up until the 16th century, but in England, they probably went extinct earlier. But the interesting thing is that Bryony Coles, I mentioned her earlier, from Exeter, she believes that there may have been pockets of beavers living in remote places, even even beyond the 17th century. And that's actually quite an interesting idea. But my question for that would be, well, yeah, when beavers are around, you can usually tell that they're around because they do make such a significant impact on the world around them. So I'm not quite sure whether it would really be possible for beavers to live remotely like that, but perhaps. I really don't know. But as I say, there's some ambiguity as to when they really went extinct in Britain.
Wonderful. Judyth, thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and then also for the discussion there. Thank you also to everybody who has tuned in. Before we wrap up, I want to say that we're going to be back on Thursday, the 6th of May at 4 p.m. with Oriane Pettini, who will be presenting on Goethe's Morphology, a device for exploring and generating complexity. And now I'd like to briefly hand over to Oriane for a preview of her talk.
Yeah, hi. Does everyone hear me? Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. So yeah, in my talk, I will be insisting on the concrete techniques, especially visual techniques that are actually grounding Goethe's practice of intuition. And in the second part of the talk, I will try to sketch out the legacy of such techniques in contemporary cross-disciplinary fields that works hand in hand, and namely theoretical biology, natural computing, and computational design thinking. So I hope you will find it interesting. Thank you.
Oriane, thank you very much. And we look forward to your talk, which will be on Thursday, the 6th of May at 4 p.m. Apologies there for the beaver flashing up. You should have had a preview of Oriane's talk. So, details of Goethe's Morphology, a device for exploring and generating complexity. You can find those on the Dartington website and the Field Centre website. If you would like to watch Judyth's presentation again, or if you think someone else might be interested, then it will be uploaded to the Dartington website and also to YouTube. Before we say goodbye, I would just like to thank everybody for co-shaping again this event. There are, of course, limitations in doing a Zoom event, and that is the type of interactions that we encounter. So I field the questions and then give them back to you, and Judyth answers. So what I'd like to do is draw your attention to the Holistic Science Conference at Schumacher College, which will take place this year on October the 1st to the 3rd inclusively. We will have very different human interactions there. So we're in the stages of shaping and finalizing the event, and we will email out to you once booking is open. Once again, thank you to all and wishing you a very happy Easter.